Are Genshin standard characters actually that bad? And if they are, what would fix them? With the release of Mizuki in version 5.4, Hoyo finally added a new standard 5-star, almost 2 years since they added Dehya, and it got me thinking about the older ones and how they compare to the rest of the characters. Now that we'll be getting a standard 5-star selector with every major update, these characters are genuinely free-to-play friendly, even more so than many 4-stars, especially the ones who improve a lot with higher constellations. Yet, they barely ever get mentioned in any discussions. Are we right to ignore them? Let's take a look. I'm going to start with the one that, in my opinion, deserves more attention than they get right now, and then steadily work from good to bad to worse and finish up with the most disappointing of the lot. For each character, I'll focus on their intended role and any flaws and drawbacks which may affect how they perform in that role. We'll touch on how their constellations change things and finish up with what kind of changes would actually make a difference. First, Jean. Her role is simple. She's a healer who can provide some extra support. Her healing is fantastic. Her burst starts with a huge heal which affects everyone on the team, and then continually heals any characters inside its circle. Even with a balanced build, she can heal well over 20,000 HP per character with that initial hit, which is up there with the best healers in the game. Her other major contribution comes from her artifacts. Like many Anemo characters, she's able to use the 4-piece Viridescent Venera set, which shreds elemental resistance when she triggers a swirl reaction. Jean can swirl using either her skill or her burst, so she's a great option. This remains one of the most valuable passives in the game to this day and is welcome in the vast majority of teams. Her burst also brings a more subtle benefit. It applies Anemo to the active character once every second. This cleanses any elemental aura present on the character, which can prevent enemies from triggering reactions and drastically reduce incoming damage as a result. Jean's biggest flaw is that her main utility is built into her burst, so she needs a high energy recharge stat to feel comfortable. Fortunately, she's not difficult to build, and options like the Favonius sword can make her even more useful by turning her into a battery as well. The other main issue with her is that her burst is a prime example of the circle impact problem, where many of her benefits disappear if the enemy happens to step outside of its range. This can be frustrating, especially against more mobile enemies. She also lacks useful crowd control, but that's really not the purpose of her kit. While I'd love it if she did, it does feel a bit outside of what she was intended to do. On balance, those are all minor flaws, and as much as I'd love for her to not have them, they're just not a big issue. Jean's constellations are also surprisingly good for standard 5-star, particularly her C4 and C6. Her C4 makes her burst shred Anemo damage resistant by 40%, while her C6 adds a 35% damage reduction. With those enabled, she becomes one of the best supports in the game for any Anemo DPS, and also an even better defensive option, especially in combination with other defensive characters. To me, Jean feels like a genuinely good character to have, and she really stands out from the rest of the standard 5-stars. I've personally always valued healing more than others. Given a choice between a glass cannon team, which can achieve a super fast clear time but requires multiple attempts to get it right, and a more comfortable team, which is a little weaker but usually works on the first attempt, I reach for the comfy teams for my first clear each round, and only bring out the others if I'm in the mood for something more challenging. Jean is a fantastic character to have for many of those more comfortable teams. And, of course, if you have Furina, Jean's value goes through the roof. Furina is at her best when paired with a team-wide healer who can build up her stacks as quickly as possible, and Jean is a great fit, especially because she can consolidate healing and VV into one character. She's the one standard 5-star that I'd encourage everyone to build, and since those later constellations actually make a big difference to her in some interesting teams, she's one of the few that I want to lose my 50-50s to. Next, Tighnari, who is a Dendro DPS. He's intended for a very fast quick swap playstyle. His skill creates a taunt and lets him fire his powered up wreath arrows several times in quick succession with no cooldown, plus his burst provides further Dendro damage. He's at his best in teams built around the quicken reaction, where he swaps in to provide a decent amount of damage before swapping out to let the rest of the team take center stage. For the most part, this playstyle works well. His biggest flaw is that most of his damage is single target, so he's less valuable against mobs of enemies, but that's far from unique to him and isn't really something that should be fixed, in my opinion. He also provides little damage from off-field, and his very short field time means that rotations built around him often feel oddly lopsided and a little awkward. As long as you put him into a team which plays into his strengths, he can be a solid option with surprisingly few flaws. Tighnari's constellations are focused on making him a better DPS, though his C4 also provides a team-wide EM buff. Only his C6 makes a significant difference, however, and even that is a little underwhelming compared to what we tend to get from modern limited 5-stars. Overall, Tighnari is a good character who only really falls behind due to his having lower multipliers. His playstyle is a little niche, but many people enjoy it, and it can be really satisfying when you get it right. However, I personally wish he was a little more versatile. I enjoy his quickswap playstyle and would want it to remain intact, but I'd also love to play him in longer rotations with more of a gun-use style role. But sadly, his wreath arrows take far too long to charge when used without his skill. This could have been possible if he had a split playstyle like Sethos, where you could choose between different approaches by using him a little differently. Imagine if using Tighnari's burst before his skill would allow him to use his wreath arrows with a medium cooldown, while using his skill first would keep his extra fast quickswap gameplay. That way, he'd remain unchanged for people who want that, but he'd also be able to fill a more sustained on-field DPS role, which would open up a ton of new teams for him. He's good enough as is, but I'm always left feeling like I wanted more. Keqing is an Electro main DPS. While some choose to play her as a physical DPS, it's more common to make use of her Electro. She can infuse her sword for 5 seconds via her skill, and her charged attacks in particular can do some decent damage. Her burst is also valuable, providing multiple hits of Electro across a generous AoE, and is particularly useful in quickswap teams. While many of her dedicated fans found ways to make her shine, for a long time she suffered from her comparatively low multipliers, which meant that it took a lot of investment or a lot of skill to make the most of her. However, arguably this is no longer as big an issue. Her damage in Dendro teams scales much better, and her ability to quickly apply lots of Electro makes her really shine. Her remaining issues are comparatively minor. The ones which stick out are her infusion's duration, which is significantly shorter than many other self-infusion characters, her stamina consumption, which can be a problem if you focus on her powerful charged attacks, and the fact that her infusion can be overridden by other characters like Bennett or Chongyun, though some people do deliberately make use of that last point to unlock some unusual teams. Keqing's Constellations are pretty underwhelming, focused entirely on increasing her damage by small amounts. According to some theory crafting that I've seen, the difference between her at C0 and her at C6 is barely more than a 30% increase. Even Tighnari's fairly average Constellations make more than twice as big a difference as that. You can really tell she's a standard 5-star from version 1. I like Keqing a lot and feel like she only falls a little behind the limited 5 stars at C0. I'd love it if her infusion lasted a bit longer, since so many other characters that she could work well with are designed with longer rotations in mind, and I'd love it if she had something in her kit or Constellations which could reduce her charged attack stamina consumption. To make her truly competitive, however, she would basically just need bigger multipliers and more impressive Constellations. She's good enough as is to complete the hardest content if you use her right, but it does take a little more dedication than it does for other characters. Mona is a little more flexible than the others, since she can be played as either support or as an on-field DPS. Her skill provides a taunt and some short-lived Hydra application, her burst provides a big nuke and very strong buff, and as a catalyst user she can provide a further buff via the Thrilling Tales of Dragonslayer's weapon. Her personal damage as a DPS isn't all that impressive, so that's a much less popular role for her, but Hydro catalysts can be surprisingly effective drivers in the right teams. Mona's biggest flaw is arguably that her buff is fairly complicated and can be tricky to really get right. It requires a more in-depth understanding of how her kit works than most other characters, and it can be difficult to get the timing right even when you do understand how she works. Some may find this extra reward for her more difficult playstyle satisfying, however. Aside from her feeling a little rough to use mechanically, her main issue in modern Genshin is the lack of sustain in the key parts of her kit. She's fantastic for generating big damage numbers from powerful nuke attacks, but her buff is very short-lived. Her Hydra application is underwhelming and only covers a small part of her typical rotation, and even her taunt doesn't last all that long either. As another standard 5-star available at launch, Mona's Constellations are also not quite up to modern standards, and even worse, her C1 is partially broken. It claims to increase the duration of the frozen status, but it literally does not do that. Aside from that long-standing issue, she does have more value in there than some other standard 5-stars. For example, her C4 provides a 15% crit rate buff, but they do also rely on her slightly finicky playstyle. While Mona was an absolutely fantastic character in early Genshin and was central to many top-tier teams, for me she feels very underwhelming compared to the alternatives. Kokomi in particular tends to take a slot instead because her Hydra application is just so much more consistent and long-lasting, and that's exactly what I would want to change about Mona's kit. I'd extend the duration of her taunt and add a longer-lasting buff in addition to her more nuke-focused Omen, plus of course I'd make her taunt reapply Hydro periodically. If she could be an equivalent to Kokomi, but more attack-minded compared to Kokomi's more defensive-oriented approach, then she would be a fantastic pick for many teams, and I'd use her just as much as the Coco Fish. And of course, they really need to fix her C1. Diluc, meanwhile, is a straightforward pyro DPS. He's a claymore user who can infuse his own weapon via his elemental burst. His elemental skill is also quite useful since it provides further pyro damage and can be cast 3 times in quick succession before its cooldown begins. Diluc suffers mostly from being an early game pyro DPS. This is one of the roles which has had the most competition introduced over time and which has been subject to the most significant and direct power creep. 4-stars such as Yanfei and Garmin can outcompete him, Yoimiya and Klee have advantages depending on the type of enemies you're up against, and Hu Tao, Lini, Arlecchino and Mawika all directly power creep him as a DPS. His burst also has an inherent disadvantage because it comes with some crowd control, which actively pushes small enemies away from you. The exact opposite of what you usually want to do, unless you're defending a monolith, of course. Personally, I find his animations to be a little janky, though that may be because I've used him so rarely that I'm just not used to them. Diluc's constellations are, again, underwhelming and really don't make much of a difference. They're primarily aimed at increasing his damage, but are either weak or actively harmful to his damage potential. For example, his C4 provides extra damage if you delay using his elemental skill 2nd and 3rd casts, but due to how this interacts with buffs, it actually tends to reduce his damage overall if you actively try to use it. In the early days, Diluc was considered one of the most reliable and consistent DPS characters and was amongst the most popular in the game. Unfortunately, he has fallen far behind the competition and he's generally left forgotten outside of a few dedicated people who love him too much to give him up. The biggest issue is his power level, and there would be no way to fix him without significantly increasing his multipliers. I'd personally want some other changes too. That crowd control in his burst is very annoying, and I just don't find his animations as satisfying as later characters, but I'd imagine Diluc mains would object to those. Though that said, it's worth highlighting that Diluc works really well with Shen Yun. His plunges are the strongest out of all the claymore users, and the alternate playstyle unlocked by Mama Bird is really satisfying and makes him feel much more worthwhile. Next up, the last of the standard 5-stars which were available at launch, Qiqi. Her kit is heavily skewed towards healing, even more so than other healers. She has multiple different sources of healing and any of them is very strong and capable of restoring characters to full health within seconds. She can even perform team-wide healing if you use her normal attacks. However, she doesn't really bring anything else to the team. Her skill does not generate any energy, and she also has an expensive 80 cost burst, so she has extremely high energy requirements if you want to use her burst with any regularity. Her skill has an exceptionally long 30-second cooldown and a mere 15-second duration, so she has a ton of downtime and is a bad fit for many team rotations. This can be mitigated by giving her a sacrificial sword, but even with that she rarely feels comfortable despite her strength. She also applies very little cryo, so she's not relevant in any teams where you'd want to set up reactions like melt for a pyro DPS, and of course she provides very little damage of her own. Qiqi's constellations are also underwhelming since several make zero difference to the role she's actually useful for. Her C6 is pretty interesting since it allows her burst to revive any fallen party members to 50% of their health, though in practice even this is more of a meme than anything actually useful. As much as I love Qiqi, she's really not all that useful unless you're building a team specifically with the intent to use her as a main on-field driver. In those teams, you're functionally invincible since her healing is just that good, but their damage output is so low that they're mostly just a meme. In terms of raw healing strength, she's more than good enough, so instead, the kinds of changes she would need for her to feel worth considering are all about fixing her drawbacks. Her uptime would need to be more consistent, either by reducing the cooldown or increasing the duration. Her cryo application would need to be much stronger and more consistent, and she would really benefit from generating particles. And again, her constellations would basically need a complete rework. And finally, Dehya. She seems to have been an experiment. Her role is very unique. She's a defensive support who provides damage mitigation and interruption resistance, though she can also be built as a DPS. Her skill creates a circle which reduces incoming damage with the portion redirected to Dehya. To complement this, when her health falls below 40%, she self-heals a decent amount over the next 10 seconds. In addition, it deals coordinated AoE pyro damage to enemies within its circle. Meanwhile, her burst is her DPS mode. She unleashes a flurry of pyro-infused punches which at least look pretty cool. Unfortunately, Dehya has a lot of problems. First, her damage mitigation role is very niche, its effect is disappointingly weak, and in most cases you still need to bring a healer along if you want to survive at all. In some situations, her self-healing can even fall behind the redirected damage, leading to her dying off-field. In the years since her release, there have been a few characters who do benefit from her more than most, for example Novelette or Chaska, but on the whole, her defensive role is underwhelming. Second, she's pretty poor as an off-field pyro applier. Her coordinated attacks have 2.5 second cooldown, so her application is very slow, and they have other caveats too. For example, they can only occur when you damage an enemy, so they do nothing against shields. She even has problems in Burgeon teams. The coordinated attacks have a small AoE which hits the center of the enemy's hitbox, so against larger opponents she often fails to hit the cores at all. And third, her DPS capabilities are seriously broken, even ignoring her underwhelming damage output at C0. Her burst targeting is janky, she can get snagged on even small changes in the terrain, and the entire thing gets cancelled if you jump. Not good if you get frozen. Worse, it's considered to be one long attack animation and therefore cannot trigger many coordinated attacks, locking her away from some of the characters she would have otherwise worked really well with, such as Xingqiu, Yelan or Beidou. And that's not even getting into things like her energy requirements, her skill and burst not coexisting, her tendency to cause knockback, and so on. In terms of strength, she's underwhelming, but all those other problems mean that she's a disappointment even if you don't care about damage whatsoever. Dehya's Constellations generally focus on her DPS capabilities, providing greater damage, extra particle generation, reduced energy needs, and a big crit boost at C6. At C6, her damage output is roughly doubled, so thankfully for people who absolutely love her, she is at least a lot more powerful at that point, though the extra damage does not mitigate some of her bigger problems. Dehya is, unfortunately, the biggest disappointment out of the standard characters, which was especially painful for many since she was often the one Sumeru character people were most excited for. There's so much wrong with her that she kinda needs a significant rework. For example, many of the issues with her DPS mode would be solved if they scrapped her current burst implementation and instead made it so that it works more like someone like Raiden or Sino, who enter an infused state which replaces their normals and charge attacks. This would provide greater control to players, avoid issues like jump cancels and janky targeting, and unlock her potential with characters like Xingqiu. Her off-field pyro is never going to compete with Xiangling, but there's really no reason for it to be so poor. Reducing its cooldown would be a good start, and increasing its AoE so that it can proc Burgeon more consistently would be ideal. And finally, her damage mitigation. I think it's an interesting concept for a character, but it really pales in comparison to shielders. They could have made it work though. If they were aiming for her to feel like a higher risk, higher reward alternative, then she should have also provided a buff after redirecting damage. This could have been a well-balanced trade-off. Despite all that, I still use her when there's room for her in my teams, and funnily enough, she was the key to 36-starring the Abyss on my casual free-to-play alt account a few versions back. The one character missing from my list is Mizuki because I didn't pull for her. If I don't lose a 50-50 to her in the next few patches, I'll be getting her from the free 5-star selector. I'm curious how she compares to the others. She's a swirl DPS and a healer with an odd playstyle. When you use her skill, she floats around and occasionally triggers swirls on nearby enemies, but cannot do anything else. Her lack of normal attacks during her skill means that, much like Dehya, she's locked away from using several premier off-field DPS characters, so I'll be curious to see whether her damage output compensates for her team restrictions. If you got her, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Overall, Genshin's standard characters are an oddly mixed bunch. Jean stands out as a great character with very few flaws, several others are decent but fall behind because of their lower multipliers, a couple have flaws which make them feel very underwhelming, and Dehya is a bit of a mess. It's a shame that Hoyo don't rebalance characters. It was a wonderful feeling when Dendro released and so many older characters suddenly became a lot more competitive thanks to the new reactions, but over time even that has fallen behind a little. I generally don't care about meta, but I do care about having variety. One of the reasons I quit Honkai Star Rail was that its endgame modes were actively discouraging experimenting with unusual or non-meta teams, which just made the whole experience less fun. So I really hope that Genshin doesn't fall into the same trap. At least the Imaginarium Theatre gives us a place to use the characters who have been left behind. Until next time!